دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء قسما بالله رب العالمين ما ارتضينا غير دين الله دين فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء
هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار ظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah and welcome to Finding Me on the ITV networks. In a previous interview when I spoke to Sizwe and Pof of Walsh, we were talking about the state of South African politics and of course the kind of emotion that many South Africans are stuck in. It is a society today that I basically categorize as somewhere between madness and schizophrenia. And in that we have to work our way out and work our way up. And part of that hope is something that comes together and pulls us into this new kind of vision, this new society that we are thinking about, that we are talking about, and that we are hoping for. But in order to get there, we have to work together. And for me, I think perhaps the greatest emblem of hope, the symbol of hope in South Africa is the youth. And I love it when I encounter dynamic, spiritual, inspirational young people who have so much to offer. And I have one such guest with me today. Dikeledi Mokoena is a lecturer at the University of Pretoria, also at the Thabo Mbeki Leadership Institute. And as we were joking before we went on to air, she said, you know what, guess what, we're all here and we qualified. And I think that makes a huge statement. So with that, thank you very much for making this time to share with me, Dikeledi.
Oh, thank you for having me.
You know, from the moment I met you, I was absolutely taken by you because I can feel that aura that comes from you, you know, that absolute difference, but so much dynamism. And when I was looking at your pictures and I even asked you, I said, the woman is interesting in your DP, and you said she's a Khoi woman and she has immense strength. So obviously you draw your inspiration and your strength, and I think in many ways also your positivity and your hope and your desire to make South Africa a better society from these kinds of figures that exist in our African history, in our society, but have very conveniently been forgotten. How did you get there, and what made you reconnect with these kinds of emotions and feelings and the spirituality?
Well, for me, I think most importantly, right, the relationship that I've had with my mother, right, whom I consider my first love, my first true love for that matter, right? I mean, she has been a very, very big rock, right, in my life. And, you know, you grow up and then you think at some point that your mother hates you, you know, going through all those phases. But then when you assess certain things in your life and certain experiences, then you realize that actually one person who's always been there, right, and who will always be there, you know, God willing, right, is basically this woman. And I'm also lucky and blessed to have two phenomenal grandmothers, although one of them is late. But these are very, very powerful women, right? I had my grandmother, Mapiso, the one who's late. She was a healer, actually, right? She was a gift. But this woman, even in her sick bed, you know, she would have this very, very powerful, commanding voice, right? And she would not sort of shy away from telling you your issues, right?
So no drama queens in her presence?
No. Right? But interestingly, she was actually super nice to me, of all her children, of all her grandchildren, of all her great-grandchildren, right? I've never heard her say anything negative to my face. So, yeah. And then my maternal grandmother, Osidi, as well, a phenomenal, powerful woman, you just sort of literal matriarch, who was literally consulted on a whole lot of things, you know, in terms of our family dynamics and so forth. And I think that for me is a reflection of the kind of, you know, sort of spirit and the kind of sort of identity that Africa and Africans actually, you know, basically what embodied us and what represented us and who we were, you know, basically people who revered these kinds of women, right? And then you find that a lot even in some of the sayings, right? In some of the, like for instance, I'll make an example with a particular book by Credo Muta, right, Indaba My Children. And in this particular book, or at least the book itself is divided into four parts. And the last section which talks about the Bantu laws, highlight basically the importance of a woman in the African society, right? And even at the beginning of the first book, right, of the first section of that book, you know, it starts with this narrative about, you know, the goddess of creation, right? And basically her being the first manifestation on earth. So basically the first manifestation of God on earth was a woman. So you have that. And then also when we go into our daily experiences, right, particularly those who come from sort of disadvantaged communities, you know that the mother or the grandmother in the community always made sure that her children or those in her household, you know, literally had something to eat. So irregardless of how little that we had, right, in any household for that matter, everybody knows this, that irregardless of how little we had, our mothers, our grandmothers always made sure that everybody is covered, right? So, and that for me also indicates sort of this principle of African, you know, sort of African-centered economics for that matter, right? Because now you're speaking about economics of redistribution and distribution, right? So you
and
have
the most macro scale in the
exactly,
in the home, yeah.
Exactly, right? And those principles, those values, I think we actually kind of lost them along the way or some way.
Yeah, because as you're speaking, it made me aware that there is still, I think we just kind of have forgotten it, or we don't maybe observe it as much because people have become so self-centered, but it's about tremendous respect for the African woman, for the African voice of the woman, and also for what she can contribute in every aspect of society.
Of course. Yeah, and I think it's unfortunate that we actually are forgetting this. But then even the forgetfulness as well should be contextualized within what is currently happening at the broader scale. For instance, we know, I'll make it a practical example. At some point in our lives, we knew when you grew up in December, everybody would go visit grandmother or whoever auntie and so forth.
Go
and
back
all
into
us,
the rural areas.
Exactly. But today that's actually quite difficult, right? We're no longer doing that. And it's largely because of the socio-economy, the economic conditions that we're in. Right? So the economy is no longer allowing certain cultural practices, so our traditions are also shaped, right, by where we are today. So you have, you know, sort of massive growth of unemployment, basically inflation also literally affecting everything, right? So the affordability of having all of these children who would visit you or would visit grandmother before, it's no longer sustainable these days. It's no longer affordable, right? So we literally are forced with those dynamics. The same as well when you think about, you know, sort of these communal practices in the townships. I'll make another example around funerals, right? So with that we knew before, when there's a funeral in the community, everybody would contribute, right? But today that's become difficult, right, because of the economic
And you still
conditions.
feed everybody also after.
Exactly, right, but it's becoming more difficult. So, you know, so this then indicates how the economy is actually shaping our cultural practices and actually altering them, right? And unfortunately altering them in the negative, altering them in basically this sort of liberal, individualistic, you know, sort of practices that we've come to associate our behaviors.
But then it's a slow erasure of your identity, your legacy and your history, isn't it?
Exactly, right? Exactly. And I guess at the same time, though this I guess would be a call for us to really strive to ensure, you know, sort of we're finding alternative ways outside of what is currently happening, because everybody is aware that we are currently under a crisis, not just in South Africa, but globally.
Yes, of course.
Right? So the current economic model is actually being delegitimized. It delegitimized itself. Oh my God, English. Right? Itself. And people are literally, I think, crying for alternatives, right? And then perhaps with those alternatives, this is where an opportunity for the re-emergence of how
your
to do
indigenous
things.
self.
Exactly, right? How do we do things? Now, how do we grow our economies differently? How do we plan differently? How do we govern differently, right? What are the principles now that, you know, we need to go back to? What are the value systems that we need to sort of resurface? Hence, I think that also partly informs this idea of a whole lot of scholars, particularly African scholars, trying to go back, right, into, you know, the history of Africa and so forth. And although others dangerously romanticize, you know, our history, But I think that in itself is an attempt to try and find perhaps that in the oldness, maybe we can inspire the new, right? Yeah, and it's not just here. I mean, you have a lot of indigenous communities everywhere, globally for that matter, right? You also have certain alternative voices in Europe as well, interestingly, you know, which goes back to this idea that the danger of homogenizing Europe, right? Or of homogenizing any, you know, of any space for that matter.
So in this environment of exceptionally powerful women, you know, who have shaped you, you also had, I suppose, a different experience in terms of your schooling. Because, I mean, the home environment is one, but then when you go to school and you interact with other students, there's another experience that happens there. So where did you go to school?
I attended my primary school, which is like a few, like 3 stone throws away from my family home in Sebokeng. The name of the school was Dikeledi Primary School. I think, again, I was blessed to have had the most wonderful teachers. And maybe it's because they had to go to work around 12. Right?
Okay, so which school starts at 12 o'clock in the afternoon?
Well, okay, so we had one sort of building, right? So you had this one building that actually was shared rather amongst 2 different schools, right? So we as Quraysha, we didn't have our own building. So we hired space there. So what would happen is you'd have one school which was called Muntusi. You know, it would operate from the morning up until 12, and then from 12 o'clock then you'd have Quraysha Primary School letters, you know, coming in from that time up until 4. So yeah, perhaps not waking up early assisted, but
Okay, I can see what drives you. Late mornings.
Late mornings, my sister.
I have to stop you there. We're going to a break. When we come back, we'll grab that cup of coffee and start on the late morning. We'll see you after the break.
بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار ظلم وحلا في مولده النغم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار ظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to the second segment today in a very dynamic interview with an amazing and inspirational young woman, Dikeledi Mokoena. And before we went on to the break, Dikeledi was explaining about her school experience and this of a rotation in the one building where school started in the morning and a second school took over in the afternoon. And Dikeledi, so you said the late morning was wonderful. And I think that has perhaps carried forward now. So walking around with these big cups of coffee, hopefully, trying to get some sanity. So in that, you said you had amazing teachers. And I think that's wonderful because there is this myth about African teachers being very lazy, not being qualified, not being at school on time, etc. But your experience was totally different.
Well, unless if my memory is blocking negative experiences, but I think we had some really supportive, right, really supportive teachers. I mean, I know, for instance, when I was graduating, during my graduation, one of my primary school teachers actually came, right? So, and this was in, I don't know, yeah, some years ago. But in terms of, I think whatever challenges that African teachers may have cannot be divorced from the training that they had from, you know, sort of the Bantustan or sort of the Bantu education. Because, you know, the teachers' colleges were basically about training a certain kind of African child.
And to keep them at a particular level.
Exactly, and keep them at a particular level. So that obviously then would then reflect, right? But then I guess to a certain extent, I was lucky because my cohort, we were actually the guinea pigs of this new curriculum that was introduced at the time.
The OBE.
OBE,
yes.
Right? So I guess there was a particular excitement around it, you know, with the changes that are coming in. So maybe you had teachers who were very, very enthusiastic, I think. But that does not necessarily divorce from also the challenges that OBE came or brought up with. So whatever limitations I have,
blame it on OBE, not me.
Not me. Right? So we blame it on OBE.
It almost sounds like the Star Wars character, isn't it?
So yeah, and then, so that was my primary school experience. And then high school, my father, who passed away in 2005, on his deathbed actually, he said to my mother, he said, of all the things, right, I beg you, please get Dikeledi a good education, right, invest in her education, right. So, and then I think from there on, yeah, because I remember I didn't even write my final grade 7 results because that's when we were burying my father. But high school, I had to sort of the conception of a better education. I was going to a multiracial white former middle C, right, school. So yeah, and I was enrolled at Val High, and it was an experience. It was an experience, a different cultural experience. Yeah.
Do you think coming into that kind of an environment, and not from perhaps a stronger background as you did, you can easily lose yourself and lose your identity? Because I think in many instances I see that happening to young black people today. They're struggling with their identity, and in many instances are trying to assimilate into whiteness rather than being proud of carrying forth this black consciousness or this level of black identity.
Well, others apparently I discovered this year from some people who said I have an English accent, so it means I was assimilated as well. And
we'll have to decolonize your
my accent.
Your accent, yes.
But apart from that, to be honest with you, actually, because there's a particular veil, right, that's put in front of you, but also there's certain things that I could pick up, right, that do not sit well with me in my high school experience, because you know I had all white teachers, and there'd be certain things, certain comments that were made. Like I know one particular comment from my English teacher at the time, whom I will not name, you know, that she said that black people do not have culture. You know?
Did she say this in the classroom?
Yeah, she said it, right? And I was like, you know, and that's actually it stuck with me. Yeah. And I know when I got to varsity, again, I could see that there's certain experiences there, and then also with certain struggles, right? I mean, I don't come from a privileged community. I mean, even in my high school experience, there were times where I'd go to school without lunch money, right? So actually almost every day. I think the only time that you'd have nice lunch would be at the end of the month when your parents actually had some, right? And I had this friend called Victoria, and we'd eat, I don't know if you know, these snacks that you buy, right, knickknacks, and we call them our daily bread. So that is essentially what we ate on a daily basis in Val High. But you know, sacrifices for better education. So now, and then you assess those experiences, right? And then you assess them, and then you look at yourself, and you look at other people. But at the same time, because there's just something about, you know, African families whereby a sense of contentment, you know, that is, I don't know, just instilled in you that, you know, regardless of all those challenges, there's still
make do.
Exactly, right? And then it was only when I got to my sociology class at Wits University, first year, when Dr. Shireen was defining poverty, and then I was like, oh, so according to this definition, I'm poor.
That must have been a shock.
I did not know what's all my life. I thought I was, you know, and it turns out I'm poor, you know. And you know, so and then it's basically that. And then with, I guess, the political activism at varsity, and then also, I mean, looking at certain things. And at the same time, I think I was also lucky to have had certain lecturers, you know, who then, I mean, critical studies is the most beautiful, you know, gift to the humanities and the social sciences, because then it allows you to see things that you have been taken, you know, that you've been taking for granted. Right?
Also, but things that have irked you, or maybe you've internalized, and you know it's this problematic, but you don't know how to deal with that or how to respond to it because you're so ill-equipped, isn't it?
Yes, right. So, and how to cope.
Yeah, how to
right?
cope. Yeah.
How to cope with it. So that's precisely what was happening. So, so it was that, and then obviously then around third year with interestingly a white man, a white lecturer who was teaching us political sociology, you know, introduced Biko. Right, so, and then we're reading Biko in class, and then you're like, okay, now Kshubi Lemanje, right? Like things are happening, like, yeah, you know, I've been feeling that something is wrong. You know, something is wrong. And you know, the
You didn't just
sad part
stand up
is,
in the class and that I was saying, man.
well, a certain thing happened when I was in my honors. I sent a particular email and it got me into trouble. But anyway, I think it's basically that. And you know, the sad part is sometimes when you see certain things and then you do not have a tool to explain them, there's a particular sense of anger that builds up inside of you, right? A
Because
sense
of inadequacies.
yes, right. A sense of, you know, bitterness that also builds up, which would then also inform, I guess, your own politics as well. On the other hand, you know, you have scholars who say that actually rage is actually a very necessary political tool, the anger. And I think, you know, this is where decolonial scholars also come in, sort of this, you know, political rage, this rage that is necessary to arrive out of us so that it gets us to do something.
Yeah, but in order to get to do something at some point, you need to be equipped, isn't it? Yeah,
Right.
so you can't continue in the sense of rage and not know how to then channel it, because then it goes out of control.
And then it becomes fruitless,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
So you then have basically, I don't know, people dying or you dying, becoming a martyr, and then nothing actually at the end of the day is changed, unfortunately. And I'm talking about martyrs. It is very interesting how, you know, the people that we celebrate today are actually endorsed by the very same people we critique, right? Sort of our heroes. It's like there's a particular construction of heroes for us, right? And that certain heroes are actually eliminated from history, right? That certain heroes are not considered to be those who are, you know, palatable to sort of the
To the
radical,
academic diet, yes,
exactly,
yeah. Mhm.
right? So, like, I know, for instance, there's certain like extremely radical black voices, you know, out there. That are not even recognized, right?
But radical in what sense, and radical to whom, isn't it? It's because when you're calling for a change in the status quo, when you're challenging the way in which systems are done, then you're radical. But in essence, what you're doing is you're trying to fight forward for that particular voice of truth.
That is very, very true. And just to also link up with that, the interesting part is how the concept also of radical is this negative thing. You know, when it comes to certain people. But again, those who embrace it or those who are fighting for a particular struggle, they actually see it as a beautiful thing, right? It's basically like black consciousness itself, right? When Biko redefined what blackness is, and in this context as well, you find that radical is this concept that has been redefined to mean something that is beautiful and heroic, right? And something worth celebrating. And I guess that in itself also indicates this level of agency.
Yes,
right?
certainly.
That
And
as
not only who
active-
controls the definition and the narrative as well.
Exactly, right? Yes. So, yeah, so there's, I guess, to a certain extent, my experience. I made certain political choices before that were not
Savory.
no.
It's okay, we're only human, we make mistakes.
You
We
know,
move on.
yes, we do. We move on. But yeah, and I guess interestingly, you know, social media is, you know, we talk about it and sort of vilify it and that it's a waste of time and so forth. But for me, a lot of, you know, the fire that I got was also drawn from there.
Okay, so we're almost at the end now. We're coming back for a second interview, and we're going to come back to that fire, because from that fire you've moved on to African feminism, to Pan-Africanism, black consciousness, decolonialism. I mean, you're carrying a lot in your basket, and we need to unpack this. But quickly, a parting word for the youth of South Africa.
Love yourself, love our country, fight for it.
Wonderful. We'll see you in next week in the next episode. في أمان الله والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
ودين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء قسما بالله رب العالمين وارتضينا غير دين الله دين فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء
هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار